Conversations, whether they're asynchronous like a phone call or synchronous like email, are the space where business transactions happen. In this episode, you're gonna learn techniques to nail these conversations. Welcome to Business Got Personal. This podcast is brought to you by VideoAsk, Typeform's latest tool. And hi, I'm Alex Antolino, Creative Director at VideoAsk and your host for today. I bring you a very special guest today, someone who spent a lot of time thinking about conversations. She's Professor Elizabeth Stokoe from Loughborough University and deployed, and she's gonna teach us some useful techniques on how to own our business conversations and be more persuasive. But the good persuasive, not the dark, scummy persuasive. Hey Liz, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Alex. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so excited. Thanks for being on the show. I'm so happy to jump on a call with you and start talking about conversation again. I remember like our conversations when you were at Typeform. I actually learned a lot, and I actually used some of the things that we're going to talk about today in my day-to-day conversations on negotiations or like my relationship with some clients. So I'm actually really, really grateful that you're here with us today.
It's nice to be back.
All right. I'm gonna ask you about one of the most, mind-blowing things that I've learned from you, and this has to do with like one magic word. But we'll get into that later. You talk about this a lot, and we'll get about like, in the second part of the episode. But before we get into that, we're gonna talk about persuasion techniques, right? So could you tell us, just to kick this off, one good persuasion technique that we can use when we're on a conversation to warm up the feelings of the other person and maybe warm up a cold lead and make it more close to like maybe a conversion or some engagement?
Yeah. So I think this is a really great question, and partly it will allow me to say a little bit about communication myth busting and what it is that I actually do as a conversation analyst, which is to do something a bit different to much of what we read in communication skills domains, which is kind of post hoc. This is what I remember is a really good technique, or it's all kind of done in theory. What I do is study actual talk in the wild. I transcribe it and scrutinize it, and from that basis of what people actually do, their sort of tacit skills and expertise, I can figure out what works. So persuasion is one of those topics where, in fact, what you probably need to think about is a lot of people don't really want to be persuaded of something. They want to change their minds independently. They want to make their own decisions. So one of the things that I found across research for a number of years now is that when people go all in to persuade another person, and whether that is a salesperson or a crisis negotiator or a mediator, what actually gets the outcome is creating the foundations for somebody to change their own mind sort of independently of the person that's trying to persuade them. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, that the outcome where somebody shifts position from one thing to another might be the same, but how you get there is important. So rather than trying to persuade somebody in a really, and it's hard to do it without being obvious, what you need to do is try to get them to try to lay the foundations for people to change their own mind.
I want to talk a little bit about small talk, because I was watching one of your talks, and you were talking about small talk and how this can be beneficial or detrimental in different cases. And so when it comes to video marketing, we always have, and I'm thinking about stories, like you might be using VideoAsk or not, but we all have done like some Instagram stories at some point. And there's always these, like, at least personally, I have this thing internally that I'm like, oh, should I say hi? Should I just jump to the question? So what do you think about like when you're doing video marketing and maybe you're sending a video to a prospect to start turning that lead into a conversion, or maybe on your homepage you're putting a video ask? What happens with small talk? How should we manage small talk on asynchronous conversations with video?
We often talk about small talk in quite a blunt way, I think. So again, my first starting point in answering this question is to unpack it a little bit and be a bit more precise about what we mean by small talk. So when if you Google it, you probably find it connected with things like building rapport and the notion that you should have small talk with people that you want to sort of, let's put it bluntly, do business with later. And people tend to do the small talk and then try to do business. So we tend to associate it with people we don't really know. But of course, we do lots of what we might call small talk with people that we do know. So as when we started our call, Alex, earlier, and this won't be in the recording, but we did a bit of small talk, a bit of catching up. But of course, it was very, very finely tuned to what we already know about each other. And one of the problems with do small talk with people that you don't know is that you can't tune it to that person, because you actually don't know whether you can really talk about the word ballet. And I was loving hearing ballet again, because Alex said it, and then you were asking me about stuff that you know is the right small talk for me. And so I think small talk can end up very generic, and then it's really obvious that it's very generic because you actually don't know the person well enough to what conversation analysts would call recipient design your small talk. So I suppose we made a little animation when I was at Typeform called Stop Building Rapport. And the point of this was to show that rapport is an outcome. It's the outcome of a really effective interaction. So my research basically shows that the most effective cold call salespeople, they're listening really carefully to whether or not the person they're talking to wants to start talking about the weather with them, or holidays, or anything at all. And as soon as they sense that it's not being reciprocated, they back away from it and move to business. Whereas some salespeople really persist in keeping on talking about uncomfortable, what becomes more and more
It's
uncomfortable.
so annoying.
Yeah.
And you're just
And
like hanging out. It's like, bye.
yeah, exactly. And so what they're not really doing is listening. So it's kind of the opposite of with small talk should come listening. And so I've got a lovely case where somebody phones up a vet and they say, I'd like to know how much it costs to get vaccinations for my puppy. And the person on the other end of the phone who's dying to build rapport says, oh, what's your puppy called? And then there's this delay and they say, Victor. And they say, oh, and is it your first puppy? Yes. Now, at this point, you should be hearing this person doesn't want to hear about and talk about their new puppy. But
Sorry, I'm
actually,
laughing because
yeah,
I remember this recording right
yeah,
now, and you
yeah,
watching, you're gonna see what she's gonna say, what Liz is gonna
yeah.
say now.
But it's funny because, in that situation, the most important thing you can do is listen and think, right, does this person, because a lot of people phoning the vet might really be dying to talk about their new animal with anyone who'll listen. So if you've got that person, then do it. If you haven't got that person, then stop doing it. So yeah, so the best thing to do is really actually think about what the purpose of the interaction is. Avoid the small talk unless it's very quickly being reciprocated, and then move to business. Because what you actually want is at the end of the encounter that the person felt like it was an effective, efficient conversation, and now they might want to have another one with you. And then the next time you talk to them, you can do some small talk because now you know them. So we need to sort of think, no small talk, do have a really effective, like focused conversation with no padding and stuff. And at the end of that, if you get there really effectively, then the next time you meet them, that's the time to, maybe start to do a little bit more, of what we might call small talk.
So what I take from this is like, don't risk it, because the impact of packing it up in a way is worse than actually not doing small talk and going straight to the point, right? And you can
Yeah.
always on the next touch point or whatever on that relationship, you can start once you know that person a little bit more. You can start building that that rapport.
Yeah. And actually, the mistake that sometimes I've seen sales folks make is that they are now talking to an existing client. And you can see from the opening of the conversation that the existing client expects to have a bit of catch up small talk. And the business person or the salesperson, they're not doing it because maybe they're very instrumental and think, well, you're already a client, I don't need to put the effort in anymore. and we're not talking about huge effort here, we're talking about actually exchanging the how are you fine, and that's all it can take sometimes to just smooth from the greetings and the answering of the call into the reason for the call, which is going to be something else.
Right. Now that this is, by the way, it's a little bit meta, right? Because we're talking with conversation, we're having the conversation. You were just
I know.
mentioning the way we started this conversation even before we started recording the episode.
Yeah.
And I guess like I need to ask you, otherwise I will die with this question. Like as someone who spends their time like analyzing conversations, listening to recording, making that funny transcriptions, and like thinking about this all the time, and you have these conversations about building rapport. When for example, when we started the call and I was like, how are you? And like, da, 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 da. Are you thinking, oh, he's building rapport now, da, da, da? Or you're kind of like,
Well, the thing is, if I didn't know you and we'd never met before, and depending on how much you extended that into other things, then I might think that. But no, I didn't think that because we already know each
okay,
other. So I would actually have found it weird if you didn't say anything at the start.
right.
We need a bit of backwards and forwards, and
Hmm.
that's why. How are you? Fine. How are you? Fine. People sometimes make the mistake of calling it filler talk, and it's not genuine. But actually, those how are yous, you know, what we see in sales talk sometimes is that the salesperson will say how are you, and the client or the prospective client will say fine, but they don't reciprocate. They don't say and how are you back. They don't reciprocate it. And that's the point, to again be really listening and thinking, well, I've tried my how are you, but they just want to know why I'm
Go to the
calling them.
point, right?
Yeah. And I've actually got a really amazing example of how just saying how are you and you're all right can to understand that, because it belongs at the start of the conversation. How do we know that we can convey to somebody, I'm in a rush and something is urgent? Well, the way to do that is to, when you answer the phone, say hi. Oh, did you leave the oven on? And because you actually don't want the person to start doing hi, how are you? Fine, because this is an emergency. And so we calibrate from the very first
Hmm.
part of the conversation what kind of thing this is going to be. And so I've got an example of somebody phoning the police, actually, and it's a domestic violence case, collected with a colleague, Emma Richardson. And what we see is that because probably the perpetrator is in the house, the person who is calling the police needs to sound like they're having a conversation with a friend. So how do you do that? And actually, what the caller says is, "Hi, you're right," and hopes that the police officer will pick up. I need you to hear that I'm having a conversation pretending you are somebody that you're not. And somehow
Hmm.
they pick it up really quickly and they manage to get the person the help they need. But it's amazing because they never actually ask for help. And I think this is relevant to what we might get to later, which is that sometimes the function of of words put one after another might not be quite the same as what they seem to be as a format. And that's important in social interaction.
Love it. So first of all, that makes me feel better about our first interaction in this call,
Yeah.
and that also gives me an insight. And hopefully, for everyone watching, we've learned so far that you can skip a little bit on that first interaction if it's a very driven. And actually, we've seen it works. You can skip a little bit the small talk, say hi, and go ask your question on that
Yeah.
video marketing piece or something. Especially if you want like a specific answer, we've seen that work with Stanley Tate with the like building leads, creating lead, generating leads on his landing page. We'll link that episode on how to do that here. And it works. It's like the shorter the questions, the better. So don't start building and saying stuff that people don't really want to hear, because that generates the opposite effect, as Liz was saying. And
Mm.
you can do those things further on when you start building that one-on-one conversation and you start actually knowing the person and you know the things that you can ask, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, cool. I want to ask you one more question, and then after this, we're gonna get into very more specific things of like what kind of questions can you ask? What is this that better than this? Blah blah. Blah. Okay, but before we do that, is there any sort of question or any sort of sentence we should avoid? It's like, don't do this. I'm telling you, if like if you're building your own sales funnel and selling like an online course, don't do this because you're gonna fuck it up. Is there any recommendation, any warning recommendation you could give us, or what do you think?
I think warning number one would be to be really listening, and whether that's in spoken interaction or writing. If people don't reciprocate what you're trying to do, then you should be noticing that really quickly and moving to the reason for the interaction. So every conversation has a purpose to it, even if the purpose is just a catch up. And if the purpose of your interaction is not a catch up, then being clear about what the reason for this interaction is at the start is something that everyone expects. Otherwise, they'll be thinking, why are we having this conversation? We've
Hmm.
been, a minute, and I still don't kind of know why what's happening here. Um,
Right.
and the second thing is to think less about a script and what to avoid and what to include, and to think more about, again, this concept of recipient design. And so to think about, who am I talking to? am I entitled to talk to them without having to make an appointment, or is it casual? Is it someone that I know well? Are they obliged to have this conversation with me, or is it kind of a favor that they're having this conversation with me? What do I need and what do they need? And to really think about the things that you ask with those sort of contingencies in mind. So, for example, again, thinking about sales kinds of calls, it's the difference between asking the question, which is really common in sales calls, and I think I saw this in some Typeform templates as well, which is, how did you hear about us? How did you hear about Typeform? How did you hear about? Yeah.
I was gonna
So
ask you for this right
yeah,
now because I
yeah,
remember we talked about this.
yeah.
Go ahead.
So there's two things about that. One of them is the position of that in the overall landscape of the encounter, and obviously it's not a good thing to do to ask that right at the top of the encounter, but I have seen that in some sales calls where somebody phones up and says, I'd like to buy something in probably in your organization, and the very first thing they say is, how did you hear about us? It's like,
So
well,
annoying. Oh my
how about
god.
hearing about what I want first? But anyway, so first of all, put it at the end of the conversation, and then the second thing is really important to the precise design of the question that you're asking, because you're requesting some information, but you're not really entitled to ask it of someone who is going to buy something from you. It will be a favor if they would tell you how they came across you as a company. So it's better to wait until the end, until all of the business has been transacted with the person who you should be focused on, and then say something like, just before we go, would you mind telling us how you heard about us? And that indicates something like, I know that I'm not entitled to ask you this, and you'd be doing me a favor by answering that question, and we've dealt with all of your business now. And that's quite different from saying, how did you hear about us, which kind of presumes that you're entitled to ask and that the person now feels obliged to answer. And that's not a good way to get that information from somebody. You should do it in a slightly less entitled way, and do it after you've done all of the business with the customer.
Yeah, I'm really happy that this came out even before, like, now that we're like halfway the episode. I'm really happy that this came out, because this is, I remember the first time that I heard about this concept of entitlement on a conversation, and it has changed the way I talk. Like now I consider like, oh, can I ask this? And it's not like being polite, but it's more like, do you have the right, like, it feels so aggressive when you're on the other side and someone else is like, and
Yeah.
you end up, maybe because you want to be polite, maybe you end up responding, but it doesn't feel like that feeling of trust with the other person you're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's get into like the tactics of a conversation, right? Probably if you're watching this is because you are an entrepreneur or you are a marketer and you're trying to find ways to improve or optimize your video conversations for your marketing. So Liz and I are going to talk about two or three. I'm going to ask you, Liz, two or three very specific questions, and let's see what we can get to try and like note them down on a notebook and start like realizing, okay, if I follow these three tips, I'm gonna start improving my conversations. So the first one I want to ask you is, what is better, and maybe you have to tell me in what circumstances, but like, if when we need to select a yes no question, so a closed question versus an open question, and if you're using video ads, you're going to have the possibility to ask a question and people can respond with video, audio, text. So, and then you have the multiple choice where you can give like two options, right? So sometimes I just don't know if I create a video ask, like I just don't know what to ask, right?
Yeah.
Like which are these questions? So is there situations in which one is better than another in my relationship with this potential customer or just converted customer?
Yeah.
How can we decide?
So this is it's a really good question again, and the answer is a bit complicated, I think.
Okay.
The first thing to note is that if you are doing something where you are building something that has a written response, so let's just start there, which might be on VideoAsk, but might be on other types of online surveys and so on. You're kind of constraining what can happen next. So in a way, I suppose what I'm saying is, you could write any question you like, but if you only give people an A or a B, yes or no response, then you could ask any question you like because you're already forcing people to choose yes or no in response. And I think that's the same as people tend to think about yes no questions, but of course what we call alternative interrogative questions or forced choice questions are also closed. Do you want an apple or an orange? If you can only choose an apple or an orange, then that is also very very forced as a choice. So let's just put the caveat there, which is if you are designing options on a form of some kind, then your design of your question is kind of moot. So let's just put that to one side. The next part of the answer is that in a way, there's no such thing as open and closed questions, and this is another bit of myth busting because I think this is important.
Okay,
So we need to think about the difference between the form of the question, which might look like a grammatical yes/no question, and the function. Like, what is this grammar a vehicle for in terms of what it's after? So my favorite example of this is going into a cafe and saying, "Do you have Wi-Fi?" And they said, "Yes." And so I then had to say, "So can customers use the Wi-Fi?" "Yes." And then I had to say, "So do I need a code?" And then eventually they gave me the code. And actually, this is in contrast to going into another cafe and not even asking for the Wi-Fi, but as they gave me my cup of tea, they said, "Oh, if you need the Wi-Fi, here's the code." And this is gorgeous because I didn't even have to ask. They just offered me this thing. And this is why, I felt so happy about that cafe. And they hadn't done anything to build rapport with me at all. All they'd done is anticipate my need and meet it without me even having to ask. So anyway, so that's just a little side thing. But going back to the, if I say, "Do you have the time?" It'd be a bit weird to say yes and then not give the time. So we need to understand that just because it's a yes/no question, it might be a vehicle for something more than a yes or no in response. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it's completely ordinary, and I wrote a thread about this, so maybe I can send the link to you. That people do far more than yes or no in response to what look like yes or no questions. So this is in real interaction. So for example, I've got a nice case from a first date, and one person asked the other, "Have you got kids?" So it's a yes no question. But it'd be a bit weird to say yes or no. You suddenly feel like, "Oh, I've asked something wrong. I've said something delicate," but it was a yes no question. So, but of course, what happens in the date is that the person says, "I've got a daughter. Yeah, she's 4.5." So that feels like a much more what you would expect in reality response to a yes no question. So people do more. And actually, I've also got some nice cases where when people do a completely flat no or yes in response, they become it's like, "Oh, what is this? Is this person being rude, or are they trying to be funny?" So I've got an example where somebody asks somebody on the phone, "Do you think you could pick me up on your way, in their car?" And the person responds, "No." And then they both laugh, and then the person who asked said, "Oh, well, fair enough." So it causes this little moment in the interaction. So as soon as you start to think about it, the closed open question isn't quite as simple as we think when we are just speculating.
Right.
Having said all of that, what the most important thing to think about is, do you want people to think about this as a no problem kind of answer that you want them to give a rapid response to? And of course, you can try to constrain what happens next by asking yes no questions in that sense, and swapping them for a WH question, a tell me, a how, a what, a why, and to actually think about that as your basic contrast. But more generally, you need to think, is my question just a yes no question, or is it actually a vehicle for something else? And that's probably your best starting point.
Okay, so two notes for me here. The first one, there's open questions that are actually closed questions, and there's the other way around. So just make sure that you know what you're actually asking. That would be
Yeah.
first
Yeah.
note. I like
Yeah.
that because it's true, and it has happened to me that I was expecting a yes or a no, and it never happened. So that's a good one. And based on what you just said, I would imagine that, like, at the very beginning of the conversation, when the commitment maybe is low and maybe you're you're asking for something from a person that doesn't know you, doesn't trust you yet, maybe it's better to not ask open questions and make things more easy for the other person with
Yeah.
closed questions. And maybe, so if you're generating leads with your video on your homepage, maybe it's a good idea to not ask open questions. And the data shows that actually it's more engaging if you have like 2 3 options. People, it's just a click. But if they need to write, or if they need to record their voice or video,
Mm.
the data show that they're like much less likely to do it. But actually on the other way around, and we have another episode with JB that I'll probably link here, where we talk about using video in the different interactions of your customer journey. And this kind of like builds and connects really well into that, in the same that maybe when the connection is closer and your relationship is more deep, that maybe it's actually a good idea to ask open questions so the other
Yeah.
person can feel that you're listening, right? So these are
Yeah.
my 2 notes based
Yeah, I think
on.
it's back to the concept that I mentioned earlier, this recipient design. If you're always thinking about your recipient, and would asking 10 open-ended questions be a real burden on someone that you've never met before? Are they
Hmm.
likely to want to do this, um, versus some quick yes no questions that are well designed? The other thing to think about, and we talked a bit about this when I was at Typeform as well, is that all yes no questions are not equal. So you can ask questions in a way that tilt or make it more likely that a person will say yes or no, um, as well as it being only possible to say yes or no. So if I say to you, would you like any more cake? That's a yes no question. And it's harder to say yes than no, because I've designed it to push you towards saying no because I want the cake. uh, and when you think about it, the grammar of that, it makes it more, you can't really say in response to would you like any more cake, yes I'd like any. And actually this was a finding of a colleague in the States, John Heritage and others, and they basically showed that when people are asked questions with the word any in them, they were more likely to say no than yes. And the contrast is with a question with the word some in it, and it's still a yes no question, is would you like some more cake? It's still a yes no question, but what they found in this particular study, which was in a medical setting, that people said a lot more in response to the yes no some question than the yes no any question. So again, it depends on what you put into the yes no
Hmm.
question, what kind of answer you're more likely to get.
So I feel like these things we kind of know subconsciously, or like we do naturally in a way, but it's really
Yeah,
useful to understand, because sometimes you might try to want to say something and you're try like without knowing doing the opposite. So any, it's closer to a no,
yeah,
some it's closer
yeah,
to a yes. So this is very
yeah,
important when you're trying to
yeah.
sell something, so in terms of
Well,
persuasion.
yeah, and actually, so I've just got a paper coming out with two other colleagues, Marie Flinkfelt and Sophie Parslow, which we can link. I can send you the article.
Yes.
And what we're looking at actually is again this notion of recipient design, and it's basically how do you ask somebody for their email address, which is a really common thing that you want to get in almost any CX or kind of
Yeah.
transaction. And we focus on the different ways that you can do that very basic activity depending on who you think your recipient is and who the recipient probably is. So we found that in one setting, the salesperson or the service provider was saying, do you have email at all, or do you have any access to email at all? And it's designed for a no. And actually what they're doing is designing their their request for information for people who are probably in this particular organization as a user not likely to have internet access. So it's done very carefully, and that's different for, and what's your email? And that's done for people who you're pretty sure has got email, and or maybe they can't even find you unless they found you online. So it's a safe question to ask in a, I'm just expecting you to give me that information. So the any question, do you have any knowledge? You can say people have, and do you know anything at all about us? And that can be a way of both designing a question that people are most likely to say no to, but the benefit of that is that then you can launch into your explanation of your service, and people feel as though you're doing it for them. So I've seen that really effectively used where
Okay.
somebody's phoned up a service, they don't know anything about the service, they've been recommended it, but they don't really know why they're in this conversation. And at some point, the service provider, the call taker says, so do you know anything at all about mediation? And the caller says, I don't really know. And now the caller is going to go and explain something to them. And now they feel as though you're explaining this to me because I've told you I don't know anything. And that was much more effective than basically the callers who just said, I'm going to tell you a bit about mediation and how it can help.
Directly.
There's someone who's like, well, maybe I know about it already, or you're not designing it for me. You're just going to dump a package of information that you're going to do to everybody. And now I feel the opposite of spoken to as an individual. Yeah.
I like that, because in the same way we think, like, if you're building like a video funnel, for example, and you're asking questions, in the same way I said at the beginning, it's really good to go straight to the point. And Liz, you already you already mentioned that, like, it's good to go straight to the point and like make short questions. Nothing tells you if they're interactive and you're clicking, nothing tells you you cannot add maybe one or two more if they're really short. And if one question maybe doesn't need a specific answer, so with one question you don't necessarily are getting data, but you're facilitating the follow-up question.
Absolutely.
That's like, I love
Yeah.
this. That's very strategic.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so, and also I realize that sometimes, like, when you don't have, maybe you're more shy or more insecure, and maybe you just don't know if you already built that connection with that person, and it's a little bit on your mind, it's a little bit fragile, you don't want to break it. And so when you ask for an email, because of course if you ask for an email you're going to follow up, right? So maybe I could see myself saying, do you have any email you wanted to give us? Just because, you want to be nice, you don't want to be pushy or anything, but actually maybe you're designing the question for no, and you don't realize. So that's that's also a good note to take. Okay,
Yeah.
we're coming to the end of the episode. I'm gonna ask you a really quick question, and then we're gonna talk for a second about that magic word that I think
Yeah.
has earned a place in this episode. So the question I wanted to ask you, let me actually check my notes real quick, is what is different? So is there any difference that we should be aware? And again, let's make this very specific. Is there any specific difference that we could make when we talk in a live conversation, like in a live setup like this, when we have exchange and we are exchanging a dialogue, versus an asynchronous conversation? Let's say it doesn't need to be video, as like maybe like both audio notes on your phone or something like that.
I think this is quite an interesting research question, actually. And the closest I've ever got to it was actually supervising a PhD student called Jo Meredith, and she looked at people. She screen captured people writing Facebook Messenger chat, and she was looking at what people did to compose the chat before sending the message. And what you can see in the way people are composing their message is that they're attending to things like recipient design. So they might start typing, can I do X? And then they delete that and said, I was just wondering if it's possible to. And then they send the less pushy one. So you can see that people are sort of paying attention to the same kinds of things. But I think maybe one answer to the question is, you don't have the opportunity once you've pressed send, it's gone and you can't fix it. I mean, sometimes we do, of course, very quickly send something like, oh, actually, I meant, you correct a spelling, or you correct something that might have come across strange, or you add an extra message, which is an emoji. But I think thinking about the sort of the VideoAsk architecture and so on, you have to get it kind of all right, and because then it's gone. And so when you're live like this, if I can see, a look of confusion on your face, I can see it, and then I can fix it live because I'm getting feedback straight away. So that's one of the differences that I think you need to be aware of, that you can't fix it mid turn. And actually it's really common for people to fix things as they go, which is why we go, actually this other thing, and we kind of do that all the time. You can't do that if you're asynchronous,
which
even though you're probably thinking it.
Yeah, so I this is very interesting because I've never thought about this, and it's true. Like, so basically what you're saying is, like, while we're talking live, we're fixing our delivery as we talk, and if we don't see something land, we can like rephrase it or
Absolutely.
But you don't have this when you are asynchronous, whether that's VideoAsk or like on messages with voice notes and stuff like that, or in writing. So This gives me an idea that if you're, let's say you have video ask, and it's not, your completion rate is not as good as you wish, maybe it's not that your, the steps that you have set up, the flow or the funnel, it's not, or the offerings are not working, but maybe you could even try rephrasing the same messages in a different way. Try to
Yeah,
do that thing that you're missing on a live conversation, and
yeah,
check out 1 week later, see if it's converting better. Because the first thing we tend to do is like, oh, so people are not clicking here, maybe it's because they don't like my ebook, of like my free ebook, da da da. But actually maybe it's just the way that in which you phrase it, that if you
yeah.
just tweak it a little bit, you try something different, it actually converts better.
Yeah, I mean, and because basically that's what we're doing in conversation, and in a way, what I'm doing as a conversation analyst sometimes is looking at those fixes that people are producing to see what it was that they landed on that actually worked, and then I can actually sort of take that out and say, this is the thing that you did that worked. So yeah, I think that's really important, and of course, I suspect this is just a theory that if you're doing a video ask, that you may, without even thinking about it, be asking more than one question in one go.
Yeah.
So it might then be kind of confusing. It's really common error in questionnaire design that people say, did you do this and this? And we always say, make sure it's just one question at a time. But I wonder if it's easier to forget that when you're talking, because you might just keep talking. So yeah, I suspect that maybe the question is unclear,
That's a
or
really good
or
point.
or it's two questions and people are like, well, which bit should I be answering? And you've only given me yes, no in response, and so I don't know which bit. That could
And
be it.
then they bail. That's a really good point. And yeah,
Yeah,
I like to think about VideoAsk or even like Typeform or tools like that as a presentation. So when you're giving a public keynote, or even like a work presentation, you have like some slides. You want to make sure you have one idea per slide. So VideoAsk, for example, it's similar. It's the same thing. You want to have one question
yeah,
per slide. So if you open your video as you're like, okay, so we'd like to know what's your name and how old are you? And then
yeah,
there's only like a blank space. You're like, okay, so what should I ask? That
yeah,
answer. Okay, cool. So I think we're coming to the end of the episode, and to wrap it up, I want to talk about this magic word that you taught me when we talked like a few years ago, and it's work. It's work. So it's proven, but based on my experience, it works. You talk about the magic word that can turn no's into yes, or at least can turn into some rejection, or so some rejectment into like more of like a positive answer. Can you
yeah,
tell what word is this and how it works?
yeah. So the word is willing. And I discovered this in research, looking at people who are basically resisting being offered a service. And the service, I think at least to say something about this particular first place that I found it, which was in conflict resolution settings, where basically people are at war with each other. The mediation service is offering, their service to try and help people come to a resolution, and people really resist the idea of the process, because what they don't really want is to talk to the person that they're in conflict with, and they think they're the reasonable one, and why should they do that, because the other person is the horrible person. And so one of the things that they'll commonly say is, there's no point in talking to them, they're not going to say yes to this service. And what some of the mediators were doing next, and this is, by the way, not intentional, I don't think, in that way. It's not Machiavellian. It's just the practice that I happened to find. I'd never have discovered this if I didn't look at actual conversation. But what some mediators were doing was saying, yeah, no, I understand, but you'd be willing to just see the mediators and talk about the first step, sort of thing. And people would immediately say, oh yeah, yeah. And sometimes they say things like, oh yeah, no, I'm completely willing. Like, and the contrast is they won't be, but I am. And so basically, in these situations where the type of person you are is to some extent at stake, and that is the topic, like, are you a nice person, or are you the person causing the dispute? Then when you ask people, are they willing to do something, it's quite hard for them to say, no, I'm not, and still seem like the nice person. So I then found that this willing, again, works in similar kinds of environments where people's moral character, who they are, is important. And there's an advertising campaign a few years ago, and it's a children's charity. I don't know how international it is actually, but it's called Save the Children. And for a while, their billboard said, "We," and then their logo is, "We save the children. Will you?" And of course, that if you look at that and think, "Nah," then you're like, "What? You're not. You're the kind of person who doesn't want to save children." So you can see that it's. I think it has to be carefully used. So I found that it worked best after resistance. So if people had already said no, and then the mediator was kind of invoking their moral character, but without this being an explicit strategy. I discovered that it worked, but I don't think anyone was remembering that they did this particularly. So there are places where this would be really heavy to use. So like if you have a partner who never puts the trash out, then you probably shouldn't say, "Would you be willing to put the trash out?" as the first opening move, because it's a bit heavy. Like, what do you mean? Are you telling me I don't do enough around the house? You could imagine that will just be an argument. But if your partner and you haven't been getting on for a long time, and you've been trying to persuade them to go to marriage guidance counseling or something, and they're resisting, then you might say, "Look, would you be willing to just try and meet the counselor?" Then that might work, because then it's about, because if you say no to that, then maybe you are the problem. So I think that's the situation. And so when it comes to things like, your lead generations and so on, you have to be careful. Like, is the moral character of this person at stake? And you don't want to exploit this notion that, and you can't use it first. It's not the thing that you would go to first. It's after resistance, when you actually think that the outcome is going to be really good for everybody. That's probably the best way to think about it.
Liz, thanks so much for this time that we spent together. It's been really useful for me personally, and I think for everyone watching too. If anyone wants to reach out to you or wants to get in touch, what's the best way to do so?
Probably on Twitter, or you can just Google my name and you'll find my email very easily.
Awesome. Thanks so
Yeah.
much, Liz.
Yeah.
So you already heard of those things. If you have a question, Liz and I will be watching here the comments for the next days. So make sure you leave a comment. And you know what I would really, really like? If you are enjoying these episodes, let us know. Hit the like button. Let us know that you connect with these ideas and these topics, because otherwise we stop doing it and we do something else. Would you be willing to leave a comment here on the comments below? Hope you hope that you will. All right. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.